Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Christina Van Sickle, and I'm the Director of Professional Practice at the college. Thank you for joining us today for this panel conversation, Serving Gender Diverse Communities with Competence and Compassion. Before I introduce our panelists, I'll go over a few housekeeping items. The session has live captions. To turn on the captions, click the Show Captions button below the video player. You can choose to see the live captions in either English or French. If you need tech support, please use the support chat at the bottom left-hand corner of your screen. Click on the icon and you'll be connected with our live support team. There will be an opportunity to ask questions at the end of the session. You can submit your questions through the chat feature on the right-hand side of the sessions page. I'm now very pleased to introduce to you our panelists. Starting from my right is Adrienne Como, a trans, queer, neurodiverse therapist who works in community with queer and neurodiverse folks. Adrienne focuses on narrative therapy and brings in the political landscape and history of queer people within their work. Alistair Smith is a patient advocate with public policy background. He brings lived experience of navigating the world and health systems as a trans man with multiple chronic health conditions. Sarah McTavish is a lead in the Clinical and Quality Standards program at Ontario Health. Sarah led the development of the Gender Affirming Care for Gender Diverse Adults Quality Standard, and Vashti Campbell specializes in anti-oppression social work practices, working with the 2SLGTBQIA+ folks and folks who are neurodivergent. Vashti is committed to improving access to health care and to supporting better health and mental health outcomes through system improvement. You can read the full biographies of the panelists on the virtual portal under the Speakers tab. Please join me in welcoming our panelists. We're very pleased that you're here to share your time and your knowledge with us today. Today's panel discussion will discuss how registrants can offer compassionate, thoughtful support to the diverse and intersectional gender diverse community. We'll also explore practical strategies for social workers and social service workers to better support clients, reduce barriers to care, and provide services in affirming and inclusive ways. During this discussion, I'll be using the term gender diverse community, which is inclusive of trans, non-binary, and two-spirit folks. We do want to acknowledge today that there are no two-spirit folks on our panel, so that is a voice that is missing and also presents an opportunity for the college to develop relationships with the two-spirit community. So I'm going to get started now by asking our first question, and it's for Sarah. Can you set the stage for us in terms of why specific gender-affirming care is needed when working with the gender-diverse community?
Yes, thank you. So at Ontario Health, we've recently developed a quality standard for gender-affirming care for gender-diverse adults. And part of that is some data collection that we have available to us from across the province. So I'll direct your attention here. But first of all, when we speak about gender-affirming care, this is really recognizes healthcare that affirms the gender identity, expression, and that could be whether it's socially, legally, or a combination of both for people. Now, we know from StatsCan data from 2021 that roughly 1 in 300 people in Ontario identify as gender diverse, but the need for gender-affirming care is only growing. Gender diverse people experience discrimination, minority stress, and many barriers to accessing healthcare, which all contribute to worsening mental and physical health. These outcomes are compared to their cisgendered peers. Go to the next slide, please. Now here we have some data on self-reported health and unmet health needs of gender diverse folks compared again to cisgendered peers. And this data comes from the Canadian Community Health Survey. So here we see that overall, the self-rated health is not too dissimilar between gender diverse folks and cisgendered peers, only about a 5% difference. But what is really striking here is unmet health needs. And this is from the Trans Pulse Canada data, where this is a striking 42% versus 4% of unmet healthcare needs of the two populations. So really highlighting again the need for gender-affirming care for this population. Now, the next two slides dig in a little bit more deeply to mental health. So here we have some data on self-reported mental health needs. So you'll see here that Gender diverse adults rate their mental health as quite poor compared to their cisgendered peers. So cisgendered rating their mental health is about 85% compared to 49 rather, of gender diverse folks. And that's rating their mental health as good, very good, or excellent. And then finally, just some data on suicidality and diagnosis of mood disorders or anxiety disorders. And here you'll see on the graphs gender diverse folks in blue and cisgendered folks in the gray. Striking differences there between contemplating suicide and diagnoses of a mood or anxiety disorder between the two populations. So again, highlighting the real need for improved mental health and gender-affirming care, the two working together in Ontario. This is just a snapshot of some of the data that we have available. Increasingly, data is helpful for us to make the case for why this care needs to be improved in our system, but this is just to give you a small snapshot, and all of these slides are available publicly on the Ontario Health website with others as well as part of the quality standards package.
Thank you for setting the stage, Sarah.
Thank you.
Vasha, did you want to comment?
Yeah, if we can actually just go back to that last slide for a moment, thank you. Taking a look at the diagnosed mood and anxiety disorders, then the discrepancy there, my background is working in inpatient psychiatry and in systems planning for hospitals and healthcare. And I want to highlight that discrepancy largely has to do with social inequity and not actually with inherent pathology. So understanding that those disorders are really existing in the context of people experiencing social isolation, economic marginalization, and a lack of family and community support as a driver for those, rather than an underlying, chemical disorder or something like that, I think is really important in our practice.
It's a really great point. Yeah, thank you. Great stage setting, both of you. Thank you. So looking at our next question, and by all means, whoever is stirred to respond first, please go ahead. What are the most important things to consider when working with the gender diverse community? And what do you yourselves look for when you seek out health practitioners?
I don't mind jumping in.
Okay.
So I wrote a bit of a list for this one because there are some key points that I think are really essential in this. First, to continue what Sarah was speaking about, I think that practitioners really need to understand the complexities of the intersection between gender identity, gender expression, and how those things play out in terms of our social lives, and particularly the economic impact on our lives. So rates of underemployment or unemployment for trans folks or for gender diverse folks are very high. And I think that as clinicians, we need to have sort of in the fore of our mind that those social experiences are shaping the everyday lives of our gender diverse clients in ways that are magnified beyond cisgender clients in our offices. So I think that's one piece. Additionally, as a psychotherapist, one of the things that I come up against a lot, or in my practice I run into, is sometimes people perceive their own competence to be higher than it is because they know someone who's trans. And knowing someone or dating someone or having a brother or sister who is transgender does not generate competence inherently. There is still a lot that people need to understand in terms of aspects of legal, social, medical transition, and really being able to examine our own biases in terms of what we perceive to be quote unquote appropriate expressions of femininity or masculinity, and really interrogating where we understand those concepts to come from so that we're not projecting those onto our clients and then basically expressing that there's some right way of being gender diverse. So I think a lot of that self-reflection in our practice is essential to engender competence.
That's great. Thank you.
Can I just tag on to that a little bit?
Please.
I just want to really highlight what Vashti was saying about there being like no right way to be trans or to be gender diverse. There are as many ways as there are trans and gender diverse people. And also another thing to just interrogate for yourself as a practitioner is to make sure that you're not putting your own expectations of what the goal of somebody's experience or transition might be as well. For some people, passing is really important. For other people, it's not important at all. And just to be mindful of that in your interactions, I suppose.
That's such a good point, that we'd have to start where the client's at and really figure out what their goals are and not make an assumption. Yeah. Thank you.
And in the spirit of not making an assumption, do you want to maybe talk about what passing is?
Oh, that's a really good point. Oh, thanks, Vashti.
Yeah, that would have been helpful, right? Okay, so I am a trans man. I was born and identified as female, and spent 32 years of my life trying to do that poorly. At which point I realized that wasn't going to work for me and transitioned to male because I had top surgery and started taking testosterone. I am now gifted with passing privilege, where most of the time in the world, people perceive me as a cis man. So that comes with male privilege and with the privilege of being my transness not being the first thing that people know about me when they see me. As I said, that's a tremendous privilege and not something that every trans person has or aspires to. Is that accurate? Well,
and can I ask about too? I think that's one thing that is really challenging at times and important for our own work as practitioners is navigating that it's not always going to be the path that people are able to take for lots of reasons, whether it's socioeconomic, whether it's the fact that hormones aren't a guaranteed trajectory of outcome. I work with lots of M2F, so male to female transition clients, and there's a lot of unpacking of internalized misogyny, identities of femininity that are very rooted in some of those beliefs. So we need to do that work as well. I'm also balancing, of course, their desirability for looking and feeling and engaging in their gender expression in the way that is, rooted in what they want and what's meaningful to them. So it's a really complicated web, I'd say, of navigation. And passing is a particularly, even within working within trans care and with trans folks, contentious for sure. Because it's not something that everyone's able even to receive or experience no matter what they do. And so we have to reconcile. So then what? What are we sort of left to figure out and navigate what that means as well? Which is challenging.
That's an important point, and I think one that people don't always consider. So I'm really glad that you brought that up. Thank you. Before I move on, any other comments? What are some of the most common barriers that the gender diverse community faces when seeking support, health, and mental health services? It's a big question.
It's where do I start? How much time have we got?
Yeah, exactly.
I think socioeconomic is a significant one. I know that's, for me and my practice was a reason we have a queer for queer sort of stream of ways we work with folks from the other therapists I connect with, because we want to make sure we're offering low or no cost therapy specifically for queer and trans folks who are navigating a different socioeconomic landscape. Family medicine is a big one. We were actually talking about that a bit earlier today. And that's just, they often will experience a lot of oppression and lack of understanding, which can be real significant barriers to achieving care. And that's important when it comes again to the idea of their transitional journey and what they want to accomplish. So I could name them more, but I'll only name two because there's other people here, but there's a lot.
Part of that is a dearth of gender diverse aware practitioners. And that's across the medical field. You, as a gender diverse person, often encounter situations where you are educating your provider on your own care in order to receive it, which is a burden, obviously, on the care receiver, and makes it difficult to build trust with your care provider, right? If you feel like you're having to teach them so that they can help you.
Yeah. And to elaborate on that, and that is a very significant problem. But the other piece of it is that it assumes that the individual, the client who's coming in, has that knowledge. And for lots of reasons, whether it's their own upbringing, whether it's their education level, whether it's cognitive or intellectual disability, we can't assume that our clients are able to educate us. We don't ask them to do that in most areas, but around gender identity, around sexual orientation, around disabilities, we often rely on our clients to give us information about themselves. That is something that we should be informing ourselves about and taking the action to ensure that we have that competence or that knowledge either ahead of time or that becomes our learning goals. To be able to support those clients more effectively. And I know, Sarah, you're going to provide some additional resources about that later as well. The other thing I want to add to that, there are so many, but I will keep them short, but is that there's so much isolation for gender diverse folks. And especially as we move outside of major centers or major cities, a lot of times people have never seen or met anyone who's gender diverse. And so the incredible isolation and fear of being different than everyone that you know is very, very terrifying. And the prospect of asking to talk to someone about that is very frightening. So trying to find, again, I'll defer to Sarah when she provides some resources as well, because there are great resources. You don't have to try to find them. They're there. But accessing those resources to ensure that you're actually able to provide that care, I think is really important, even if it's just a welcoming doorstep so that you can refer onward. And the other thing that I think doesn't get talked about a whole lot, but does show up a lot in my own practice, is that a lot of folks come from religious or cultural backgrounds where being gender diverse is really not acceptable. And that shows up in like across color and creed and spectrum of identity. But people who grow up in high control religious or cultural environments often have an even deeper ingrained fear that if they talk about this difference that they're experiencing, that something terrible is going to happen to them or their family or their loved ones. And I think that's a factor that as clinicians, when we're looking at a family system or a community system, sometimes we don't take into account deeply enough the impact that sort of social or religious and cultural milieu can have on a person's even comfort or confidence saying, I need to talk to someone about this. So I think that it's important for us to have those things in our mind, that when people come to talk to us or bridge that gap by opening the conversation, we really need to be paying attention to the systems around them.
No, just that your last point, Vashi, highlighted. So the quality standard, to bring it back to that, highlights really where the big gaps are in care for the trans population. And the very first statement, or it's sort of like a recommendation for clinical folks, is really around cultural competency as well as clinical competency. You need the clinical competency, of course, whether you're in mental health care or whether you're a primary care provider, but then that cultural competency piece as well, and looking at it really holistically. And there are a number of really good resources that folks can turn to increase their cultural competency, whether they're working with gender diverse populations and or others, to improve their practice. So we'll make sure to access those as well. And another thing that sort of struck me when you were speaking is some of the other really pertinent data that we have is, how many trans folks actually have a primary care provider, which is quite similar often to, we know there's a shortage of primary care providers in the province, but quite similar data to cisgendered folks. But then when you look at how many of them feel comfortable talking to their primary care providers about their gender identity or gender expression, it's incredibly low. So they may have those providers in theory on paper, but being able to talk to someone at a primary care level about their needs is often just not happening. So really challenging from a physical and mental health perspective as well.
Thank you.
I just wanted to tag on to what Vashi was saying. Again, particularly in the context of treating somebody in a mental health state with a mental health condition, that those fears and anxieties about the consequences of coming out as trans or questioning their gender identity are in many cases not unreasonable, right? These aren't like anxieties to be managed. That's like an actual real lived problem that is not unlikely, as Sarah was mentioning with the statistics around familial support.
Yeah. One piece I want to piggyback on as well is the notion of cultural competency. This is not the place to critique it, so I won't. But I want to elaborate on it to say, taking it a step further, especially in how we're engaging in self-reflection in our practice, I think we can really look towards something that's described as cultural humility. And I would really encourage people to, in your own practice, to learn about cultural humility and what it looks like to engage in that practice with your clients one-on-one.
That's definitely, that's it there. Yes, thank you.
Some of your you mentioned earlier, Vashti, regarding the experiences folks have into like isolated communities. So I live in London, Ontario, and we're just talking about this. The queer hub in London is very underground. I had to go through like Discord servers and Reddits, like find the queer space to go to, even on my own journey. But with that in mind, I think comes as a part of our own internalized work, demystifying and sort of conditioning ourselves into how transness looks like. I think one big mythology is that what you've always known, you had these experiences as a kid. Well, if you grew up in a rural community or you grew up even in London, I grew up in Meadowville, like in the GTA, and I didn't meet a trans person until I went to university in like a diverse community like Mississauga, Meadowvale. So lots of folks are going to come in their time of their lives, with, maybe their first time thinking about being gender diverse is in their mid-20s. And that kind of really shakes up the narrative understanding of how our medical system often works with trans folks, which is something to keep in mind, I think, in the constant work of navigating our own beliefs and our biases regarding how gender diversity is met in the space and how people come to that sort of understanding of themselves. Yeah.
One more elaboration. I think this is a really great point, Adrian. And I mean, I originally came out when I was 14, and that is longer ago than it looks. And I will say it is not uncommon for people to kind of have a realization or a degree of self-awareness in their 50s that they're transgender. This idea that we have right now that people are 25, then they're coming out old, is a very new idea and culturally very specific to our time and place. But I have clients who are coming to me to talk about the fact that they have 2 children who are going off to university, and they're, a person who's identified as male their whole life now realizes that they're female, and their whole family is adjusting to what that means. So there isn't a time frame. It isn't that, people know when they're children and then they grow up and they transition and it's done. And it isn't people come when they're 20 because they went to university and met some trans people and realize, oh, this is an option. This is a lifelong journey for people.
Yeah. It's a really good point. And I just want to remind you that please just talk and apologize. It's okay. If you're inspired, please do. Haley is watching the time press. She'll tell us when we run out, and that's so don't worry about it. Okay. I was really struck, during that conversation as well, about having to teach one's healthcare practitioners about how to give care to them and what a barrier that is and what an extra burden that is. And wouldn't that be that much more difficult if your healthcare provider wasn't receptive?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that was something that really struck me when you were all talking as well.
And Christine, I think you raise a good point. If the healthcare provider is actually not receptive to that information, often that begins to become pathologized.
Yeah.
As a client who's difficult, a client who's demanding, a client who wants more than what other patients or clients want. Mm-hmm. And so there's a sort of tenuous process in trying to educate our healthcare providers about our own lived experience, when sometimes their responses are, well, I'm already the expert, so if you're trying to make me learn something new, you must be a problem.
Mm-hmm.
And when we see those extremely high rates of anxiety and mood disorders, these are all factors that contribute.
And you can end up with some diagnoses that you don't necessarily deserve at that point, too.
100%. Thank you, Alistair. Yes.
Yeah, it further bolsters internalized transphobia. I think of how my own GP reacted when I started talking to them about it, and their questioning was, how long have you had these issues for? And that language is so important, right? I'm like, oh, I don't know. I just gave the answer. I know the script, so I gave the answer I was supposed to do, and then I got the referrals I needed to get to see. And I'm still working with those, right? But it's just one of those things where and I'm a therapist with the advocacy skills. And I find that exhausting. I had my own anxiety about that, my own feel of harm around that. And I can navigate that because of that's a privilege of what I do for my work that allows me to do that. If you don't have that, which most of our clients don't, advocating for yourself in the healthcare field is in itself an exhausting barrier to navigate, which adds to that further stigmatization of self as well, then doubt, which is really important too, to navigate. So
thank you.
Yeah.
So moving on. Like all communities, the gender diverse community is not a monolith. Some community members may not relate to or identify with others. Additionally, community members will have intersecting identities, and identities can be fluid. Can you share examples of what comprehensive support looks like through this intersectional lens? It's a big question.
Yeah.
You threw me at comprehensive.
And my brain had you had me, and I'm like, oh wait, hold on, I have all these other things I wasn't thinking about. I think one big one that comes, and we talked about this, I think, when we met a bit ago, was the understanding of the detethering of gender expression and sexual orientation, which is again a pervasive mythology in our cultural sort of zeitgeist of how we think about gender, because those things can be very fluid concepts for people in their own right. And I think, when I think about a comprehensive support piece, it's not a lot of it comes into not making those assumptions that it's because somebody is engaging in their gender expressional journey, that their sexuality will be tethered or not tethered to that. It could be, it could not be. I think when it comes to offering comprehensive support, the stance of, and this is one of the big reasons I think I enjoyed the narrative format of how I would do my work, is the curiosity that you need to have to be open to asking questions, be open to not making assumptions, so being curious of how these things are going to show up here or there. And then we kind of, I think, talked about this a little bit earlier too, but a second point with this is not assuming that their gender diverse journey is going to end up in a particular time and place, an end finale sort of set of, like, of passing, for example, of hormones, of surgeries. It may not. It can go wherever it needs to go. And I think the idea of meeting the client where they're at, curiously exploring where they want to go, and just feeling that feedback with them is so important, because not everyone's going to be able to or even wants to access the same type of care, but that doesn't make their gender diversity any less real or significant or complete, because they don't go through this like tiered process of care. And they want to instructionalize things so often, but this is not something that you can. Being more open and curious is maybe a better framework for that. Yeah,
I think that's a really good point, Adrian. And I also, as I sit at the end of this panel, I can see everyone before me. It's easy to observe that we're all sitting here with white or light skin privilege. And the reality is, as clinicians who are working with people from a very wide spectrum of lived experience, the reality is that, every individual's gender journey is going to be different. But when we layer on factors of living with disability or of being a person who's racialized or Indigenous, the experience of transition or of being gender diverse changes. It's not the same. People don't experience, I don't want to speak for anyone that I'm not a part of the community, but I will say from working with clients who are racialized people, that their experiences of navigating trans healthcare or trans services is very different than that of their white counterparts. They don't often walk into a clinic and see someone familiar. They don't see themselves reflected. I don't think there are any, for example, Black or African Canadian trans-affirming doctors that I've heard of. I could be wrong, and I'd be very happy to be wrong. But there are lots of folks in our communities, in our gender diverse communities, who don't see themselves reflected, even on this panel, let alone in the broader healthcare environment. And I think that's something that we really need to be attenuated to, that just walking into, just being a friendly face or an open door or a safe space doesn't mean that we can go around and then, not examine my, the privilege that I have as a white person navigating these spaces, or the privilege that I have as an able-bodied person navigating these spaces. So I think, and this is where I say the word comprehensive is what I stumble over. I'm not sure that there are strategies for providing comprehensive support, except to go back to that term of cultural humility. I need to be able to recognize what I don't know. I need to be able to recognize what I'm not an expert in, and really lean into not asking my client to inform me about it, but making sure that I'm informing myself, making sure that I'm accessing those resources. And I think a great example of that, we're going back 20 years, but it's unfortunately still so relevant. So many years ago, I was part of a project at CAMH, the Center for Addiction and Mental Health, called Mothering on the Margins. And we were working with lesbian, gay, bisexual, and trans-identified women to talk about their experiences of pregnancy, parenting, and postpartum care. And as we were soliciting responses to our surveys and interviews, we had a lot of white people respond and not a lot of anybody else. And we really had to dig into what's happening, that we're missing huge swaths of our community. And we ended up creating a poster that still floats around. It's called Queering the Family Tree. And on the poster, we really reached deep into our networks to find out what is the language that racialized Indigenous BIPOC communities are using to describe their own trans and gender diverse experiences that are different than the language that white and academic communities are using. And that's still a really pervasive problem, both in the literature that's being produced, the evidence that's being produced, and frankly, as much as I appreciate that we're all here today, even in this panel. Yeah. So I think that that's something that when we're talking about how do we provide intersectionally aware support, we really need to be looking at ourselves and doing our own work, both internally and also in terms of our own research.
That's great. Thank you.
That was a fantastic point, and I'm going to go in a completely different direction. Back to something that Adrienne was saying about not making assumptions about where somebody's journey is going to start or end. Just a point also that like identities can be fluid and also layered. Like there are many trans and gender diverse people who don't feel like they're part of the LGBTQS community.
Yeah.
There are trans and gender diverse people who have transitioned and now consider themselves straight. Which is a perfectly valid sort of response. On the other hand, like speaking only for myself, I came out as a queer woman at 19, and then that was my community until I was 32. So even though I've now transitioned and I'm a man and I'm married to a woman, I'm culturally queer, and that identity remains even though notionally and visibly my lived experience seems different on the outside.
Mm-hmm. And I think, Alistair, just to pick up on that picks up on another piece of passing, this idea that you and your partner, your wife, can move through the world and actually pass as having heteronormative, heterosexual, straight privilege.
Yes.
Right? There are these layers of passing as well.
Yeah, and people are so much nicer to us, which is gross.
Yeah, sure is.
I mean, also just a thing that people will encounter. I mean, there is the corollary of passing is invisibility.
Yep.
Which is a privilege because I'm not subject to the kind of intense observation and scrutiny that non-passing trans and gender diverse people have. By the same token, I am also missed often by members of my own community. Yeah. Somebody clocked me the other day. I was so happy.
It's the reverse part of the pendulum.
Yeah. So, which it's not by any means like equivalent to the social difficulties that come with being a non-passing trans or diverse person, but just as something to be aware of as service providers, like there is that you might have clients who have a little bit of grief around that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, to have been part of a community and now feel that because of how you appear in society that you're more distant from that community.
Mm-hmm. I mean, the remarkable privilege of being unremarkable, right, is
mm-hmm.
That's really profound.
a much smaller problem though.
No, but it's
that out there.
So yeah, insignificant though, right? And I think, and that comes within our own community as well, of not recognizing the shifting places that people can go to as well, and how it connects back to things that internalize. The internalized transphobia that we as practitioners will see and have to work through and navigate, right? Because that is where you can see some of those like attitudes, beliefs, and assumptions come in from one gender diverse person to another as well, right? It can be very challenging that way. Yeah.
That's interesting to hear that between different gender diverse people, that of course they're going to be having different experiences that way because they're different people.
Yeah.
So interesting. Really valuable insights. Curious about maintaining professional boundaries, because we know that this is essential in all professional relationships. And we're wondering, are there any boundary considerations unique to the gender diverse community that require special attention?
Can I start with that? Mm-hmm. This one is something that I was thinking about that I think that cis people may not be aware of, that when you're starting to question your gender identity, or starting a transition, it can be a period of intense vulnerability. So you might be looking at somebody sitting across from you or on your screen who is, in their 30s, and you think, okay, well, they're, they've got some life experience. They should have a fairly robust sense of self. That you make some assumptions about the tools that they have at their disposal. But truly, it's like a second adolescence.
Yeah.
And so while the person may look like they're in their 30s, inside they're like 14 and having a really rough time, which is something that I don't think you can understand really unless you've experienced it or somebody's told you.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think from a boundary place, I think one thing that can be really challenging, I think I'll link back to what I said earlier about, living in London and the smallness of that community. The chance that I will go to these hubs and not see clients that I work with is zero, like just fundamentally zero.
Yeah.
And so as a practitioner, it's really about having an understanding of the complexity of what the concept of dual relationship means. Vicki Reynolds, The Shirt Off Our Backs is a great article for folks to check out and read. But it writes a lot about the ideas of how like we need to have some more flexibility of what that looks like. And you have a lot of like self-awareness, I think, about being in community with queerness. And this just kind of gets more of a problem as a gender diverse person in the smaller and smaller communities you go to or interact with. And even for practitioners, thinking about the impetus of people listening say may not be gender diverse themselves, want to support gender diverse people, you're going to enter into a pretty small community as a practitioner when you're trusted to be with somebody in this type of journey, which means that your public life may shift too. And you may notice it may be more important for you to attend things like counter protests to that march for whatever that stupid rally was a few years ago. Like I saw my own clients were counter protesting together, and we planned and agreed to that and had like ethical rules of engagement for what that looked like. What we obviously didn't talk about and did talk about in the public space. But I think your communal life shifts quite a bit when you get into this work, because that invitation to that community is really like important. And I think maybe use the word sacred. So treating it with that like mutuality of respect, that like, especially if you're in the cis lens and somebody trusts you to navigate this gender diverse journey with you, that's not like a small thing. That takes a lot of like trust and courage for them. It's a respect that fulsomely is important. And that means being more flexible or open to hearing and navigating things in your political life, that political sort of queerness, the difference between like a queer as identity and queer as politic. Buckle up, because you're going to have to do a lot of learning about queer as politic, I think, to do this work in a boundaried and like ethical way.
Right. Ally is a verb.
Yeah, right. Ally is, yeah. It's an action. It's not just a sticker or like a thing on your door, right? It's how do you live in that real space of navigation of allyship is something to think about for sure. Or don't do the work. And they sound harsh, but if you're not willing to do the verbiage of allyship, if you're not willing to go and put your own personhood in a similar, not similar risk, but the reality of holding that space, then working with folks who are gender diverse may not be the work that you should do, because it requires, I think, that type of verbiage, that action of allyship, that political nature of it. Especially now, I think we're seeing that more than ever is important. So. Yeah.
There's sort of two pieces that I want to touch on around that. One, first, I want to pick up what you're both speaking about, but Adrian specifically, you've both spoken about ally as a verb and how we really embody that. And one of the things that I think about as a social worker who's very rooted in anti-oppression social work, when I worked in healthcare, people used to ask me, like, how do you do anti-oppression in healthcare? And I used to describe that the system itself is what I view as my client. I am working as an advocate with my client. I'm walking alongside them, but we're challenging a system together. And I think that that's really where this idea of ally as a verb comes, sort of where the rubber meets the road, if you will, in this work, is as a clinician, I'm supporting an individual or maybe community members to navigate a system that is largely structured against them, structured against their well-being. And so my allyship with them is being the person who knows how to access some of those spaces or open some of those doors or create some of that systemic change so that the individual I'm supporting can have a better experience. But sometimes I think it's necessary to actually shift our lens about how are we viewing where the work is happening? Am I working with that individual in terms of changing their own perception or that sort of thing, which is not my approach necessarily, or am I working with that individual to change the experience they're having by changing the system they're experiencing? So I think that's a really important piece of it's not a difference in how we're navigating boundaries, but it is a difference in how we're understanding our relationship to a client. And then going back to some of the aspects that I think are quite different when we're navigating these relationships. One of the things that comes up for me all the time is, as a person who's been out for a long time, one of the things that jumps out at me is when, kids who are part of a BIPOC family grow up, they experience racism at school, and they go home and they talk about it, and their family has probably had that shared experience, and there's someone there who can understand. And when a gender diverse kid comes home and gets bullied, there's probably not a gender diverse grown up at home. and they might be getting bullied at home also. So the idea, sometimes in queer communities, we talk about chosen family, and that's a different category than what I'm talking about. I'm talking about queer family, where we actually hold generational knowledge that we need to share with younger people or with people who are coming out in our communities that they don't have access to. And this is something, without getting into too much of what's happening south of the border, is really important right now. A lot of people are feeling very frightened by what's happening globally. And when people don't have the awareness that our communities have thrived for generations, even if it's underground, we need to share that information. And that comes through what I talk with literally all of my gender diverse clients about as queer family. We have to be the knowledge keepers for one another to share that. So I think that that's something that's quite different in working with gender diverse communities. And in saying so, of course, I assume that the clinician has some shared experience. And I'm just going to leave that on the table right now. The other piece I think is really important is that with most clients that I've worked with in my life, I don't get into deep conversations about their sexuality, their sexual experiences, their bodies, their specific experiences of puberty and secondary sex changes. And with trans clients, these are clinical conversations on a regular basis. You know, I have conversations with parental consent with 14-year-olds who are going on puberty blockers about what that experience might be like for them. I have a 17-year-old I work with who talks with me about their experience on testosterone and what's uncomfortable about it for them. And those are deeply personal conversations that in a lot of contexts would be inappropriate. And in this context are clinically appropriate and necessary. And so I think there's also a lot of medical, anatomical, and biological knowledge that's actually necessary to be able to do that work safely and effectively.
I'm curious, Basti, when you're starting out on those conversations, like what are the boundary parameters that you put around that? Like how do you set the stage to have those conversations?
I mean, I would say it's different with children and adults first.
Yeah.
So with kids, I start with a conversation with the parent. We're going to assume right now the parent knows the kid is coming to talk about gender. Mm-hmm. And so I start with a conversation about the parent to say, hey, you know, sounds like you guys are talking about puberty blockers, or sounds like your kid is going to start testosterone or estrogen, or are you okay if I talk with your kid about some of their like development of secondary sex characteristics that will change over time? Is that something you're comfortable with me talking to your child about? Mm-hmm. So I have that conversation very frankly with parents beforehand, and obviously document it also very clearly. And then if I'm talking to a child, I really let child or teenager, I really let them take the lead, but I open the door to say, look, you're starting like, right now it happens to be I have kids starting testosterone, so that's my example, but like you're starting testosterone and we both know your body's going to change. I just want you to know that I've heard it all. I'm totally open to talking about what happens. You know, if you never want to talk about it, we don't have to. But if you do want to talk about it, there's nothing that's off limits. And I even invite kids, like I say to them when I work with them, they're welcome to ask me anything. It doesn't mean that I will answer everything, but they're welcome to ask. And so that's, I'll say, the gist of my initial approach with kids. And with adults, I just say, look, I know that sometimes when people come to therapy, they don't assume they're going to come and sometimes with adults, I use language that is less clinical because I think it can help people feel a bit more comfortable. But I'll say, like, people don't necessarily come to therapy thinking they're going to be talking about, like, how things are going in bed with their partner. But your body's going to go through a bunch of changes, and some of it might be confusing. Some of it might be overwhelming. Some of it might just make you feel uncertain. And we can talk about all of it. Right? So I really just try to open the door to say, like, I know that those things are going to come up. If you want to bring them here, that's okay.
That's really helpful. Thank you. Adrienne, I was curious as well when you were talking about community, that you were talking about dual relationships. And I was wondering how you navigate those boundary conversations with people.
Yeah, I'm usually pretty forward about it with folks, especially when I work with folks in my area. I'll say, listen, like, you know, there's our hub is called Nexus Hub. So I'll be like, you know, if there's an event this week that I'm interested in going to, and this is our precursor. I should probably start from the beginning. Our precursor conversation is, we're both a part of this community. I'll ask the client, what's going to make you feel the most comfortable about my presence there? And I think that's really intentional, because I think what is the expectation a lot, this is just of gender diverse or queer therapists, but across all sorts of lenses of intersectionality, whether it's BIPOC, indigeneity, for example, as well, is that the therapist will bow out of the community. There's one hub. We both got to go there. I need queer community, they need queer community. So that's, I intentionally will start the conversation. So when I'm in presence there, how do you want us to navigate this relationship? Where do we set our limits? And that's where they take all the lead. They set the limits. Sometimes clients will be like, I don't want to talk at all. Most of my clients are like, just obviously don't talk about therapy stuff. We can talk about whatever's going on in the event itself. But I think that's a really intentional part of that, of navigating that dual relationship part, is that, again, like, not coming with a presupposition that I'm going to isolate myself as a gender diverse therapist, because that's not sustainable. And in lots of communities, this is not possible.
Yeah.
And I think most folks are pretty understanding, because in the same way, I think kind of going to the boundary thing, and another boundary is about use of self. The big part of our own experiences, we have that type of, queer familial wisdom, right? That we experience in our own ways. And my clients usually understand why I'm saying that. I may say, this is our one community in our city. It sucks that that's what it is. It's the one place that we can both go to. Can we figure this out together? And I've done that with supervision and kind of got some green lighting to do that. But it is unusual. It's a very different way of approaching, I think, the way that that I was initially trained into a boundary relationship, and the way that I usually trained what the expectations would be. But of course, the idea is to balance the needs of your own self with the client needs, and then how to navigate that in those complicated scenarios.
Yeah. That's really useful. Thank you.
I will just piggyback on that. So I also work in a rural community, live and work in a rural community. And I have found so much support just talking with other clinicians who have grown up and lived and worked in rural communities a lot longer than I have. I mean, when we get into trans and queer communities, the community gets smaller again. But the reality is, many of you who are watching, right, are navigating boundaries where you see your clients in the grocery store all the time. And there's a lot of wisdom in our social work and social service work communities of this already happening. We're just doing it in a way that is concentrates it even a bit more intensively, I think.
There's London has multiple grocery stores. So that's an easy one for me. But yeah, some places don't.
Right, but not everywhere.
Where my partner grew up did not. There was the one store, right? So she would see her work all the time and vice versa as a teacher, right? So very similar.
I mean, there are lots of folks who are, I remember working, for example, with a woman from mainland China at one point who spoke a very unique dialect of Chinese. And she did not want to receive service from anyone in her community, which is very reasonable. That felt too close for her. So whether it's communities of geography, communities of association, these are boundary conversations that our social work and social service work communities have been navigating for decades. I think we, as clinicians working with transgender, diverse, queer communities, we can really be leveraging knowledge that already exists in a lot of respects.
Yeah, and if I can add one thing that I forgot to mention, I think that there's a fluidity in these boundaries as well that will shift. So if I had a client ever say, I'm not comfortable with you being there, my response would maybe be like, can I support you by finding another thing? And this is, I think, kind of a secondary part to this too, is part of the boundary work you need to do working with gender diverse folks is not working in isolation as a therapist, working with other people in your team, because I'm really, I feel really privileged to be able to say, I understand that, but I know and I trust other therapists in my team that I can refer you to and warm transfer you and connect you with, so that we can both attend this pace together without having that interconnectivity as being therapist-client as well, giving that out as an option. And I think that fluidity is really important. And, we shouldn't be really working in isolation in general, regardless of who we're working with. But I think it's more important when you're sort of navigating complicated and nuanced community conversations like boundaries and relationships.
To create a solution.
Yeah.
Thank you. Just want to make sure that we've got everybody. So I'm just curious, moving forward, what advice, creative interventions, innovative care, or resources do you recommend for professionals who want to better support the gender diverse community in affirming and inclusive ways?
Shall I start? Please. I've been quiet for a bit. Earlier, I alluded to Sarah.
They foreshadowing.
Look, a warm introduction.
So maybe I'll just speak really briefly about the work that Ontario Health has done around this topic recently and the work that we continue to do, but specifically the creation of the quality standards. So quality standards are not like a clinical practice guideline that folks may be familiar with. They're not the A to Z comprehensive overview of how care should be delivered. They really are Ontario specific, and they hone in on where the big gaps in care are for a given topic, condition, processes in the healthcare system. And so while we've done quality standards on many, many topics, from chronic disease to mental health topics to maternal and child health, this is a very different topic, because not to pathologize experiences, but really to help drive better quality care. And that's why it's called a quality standard, to improve the quality of care for gender affirming care in Ontario. So what we ask our committee to do when we're developing the quality standard, which is, I'm happy to say, made up of over 50% of folks with lived experience, and then folks from around Ontario, including lots of rural and remote folks who practice and work, have lived experience as well, help us to develop where are those big gaps in care for this topic. And we make them sort of like whittle it down to the top 5 sometimes. And that's where we focus our efforts, and we write the quality standard on these are the big gaps, and this is where we want folks to focus their attention. So, of course, things like education come up, and we talk about cultural humility and clinical competency for this topic. We talk about gender-affirming environments, for example, what a space looks like. That's not just the poster on the wall, for example, but that might be gender universal washrooms, gender inclusive washrooms. It might be the bricks and mortar things, or it may be also the communication styles, the client-led conversations, not understanding that these trajectories are not linear, that folks, are on a path, and that can change often while you're working with clients. So just to highlight that the quality standard is not that kind of comprehensive A to Z of how you do this care. It's really honing in from a little bit about the data that we have. So there's a mental health statement for sure, but where the big gaps are in Ontario, where we need to focus our efforts. So part of that work is the quality standard. There's what we call a patient-client family guide, and that's sort of a plain language summary of what's in the quality standard with locally available resources, as well as questions that people may want to ask, things that they may want to share with their providers. We've talked about, a lot of them have come up just now, but things that how people may want to start conversations, kind of acknowledging that unfortunately very real, that people have to educate their clinicians in many cases, unfortunately. So those are some of the things that the quality standards tries to bring. And then we have other like implementation tools at the system level, slide decks, like the things that you saw that people can take to their teams, whether they're in primary care, whether in their mental health, whether they're in a hospital setting, and make the case really for this is why we need more education in this topic. This is why this needs to be a quality improvement topic for our team, and we need to increase our capacity and our skills. So those are all available. That's my sort of plug for the quality standard. But we worked very closely with Rainbow Health Ontario for the development of the quality standard. They were our partners in developing it. And they're really the Ontario leaders for the education, training, and resource development in this topic. So they have things like a mentorship call, which is for clinicians, that happens twice a month, where folks connect virtually and can really ask questions and can do that mentorship and can say what they don't know and ask those questions in a safe space with other experts across the province and get the connections and the education that they need in that kind of informal way. And then Rainbow Health Ontario has many, many formal education opportunities for clinicians, done sometimes in person and sometimes virtually, that are really well done. And they go all over the province to educate teams. So those are some of the things that we point folks to. Transcare BC also has a lot, but in terms of locally available resources in Ontario, Rainbow Health Ontario has a lot of those, and we've linked to all of those in our work through Ontario Health.
That's excellent. Thank you. That was a comprehensive response. Does anyone have anything they'd like to add to that?
Just that I think it's okay if you I think one thing that's really important to do, especially if you're working with gender diverse folks and you don't occupy, being gender diverse yourself, is to be in community with gender diverse therapists to comfortably refer to as well. And I don't say that, and I said that earlier, maybe don't do the work. And I'm like, oh, maybe that sounds a little harsh, because what I was trying to really get at is the idea, like, being our own we're our own navigators of our own competency. And we actually have we're emboldened with a lot of trust to say that I'm not competent or I am competent in a particular field. And that's that's a significant amount of trust that we're given to do from a professional lens. We need to really hold that with security. And it's okay to say, I don't think I'm going to be the right fit for this person.
Yes.
And not to be like, good luck, go find someone else, but to have a network of therapists that you can be like, I trust this. And because I can tell you as a gender diverse person, I've screened my resources because I would be mortified if I referred a client to somebody thinking it's going to be good and it was a total disaster for them. I think this is so because of how like one or two stigmatizing interactions with healthcare can set people back years of their journey, of their processing their own experiences. Having those interpersonal relationships with gender diverse therapists is really, really important. And it's not a thing to be ashamed of or, feeling negatively towards the self about. We do that with all our other work. This is no different than the same way I would refer someone else if I wasn't competent in one area or another too.
That's an excellent point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's like what I meant to say earlier with less words.
A piece that I want to add to that as well is I think, Alistair, earlier, you mentioned that because you had originally come out as a lesbian, you experienced yourself as culturally queer.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's really important that as clinicians, we actually familiarize ourselves with the concept of being culturally queer and what that means. You know, we recognize that when we look at diversity writ large, there's a lot of cultural difference, and we can learn about cultural differences. We recognize that in deaf communities, there's deaf culture. And the same is true in queer and gender diverse communities. And I think that we do a disservice to anyone we're working with who's gender diverse if we don't make an effort to inform ourselves about the culture of that experience. So I think frankly, easy ways to do that are read books by people who are gender diverse, watch TV programs by people who are gender diverse. It doesn't all have to be, academic and frankly a bit dry and boring, although I like academia, but not everyone loves it. But it's okay to watch a TV program that's like, oh, hey, a person's coming out. Let's just see what that's like on this one show. It will be one description of one experience, but it gives a bit of insight into what are those culturally queer experiences. So I think that's one piece. And the other thing I want to highlight, this is not specific to gender diversity. It's just specific to interrogating our own privilege and our own bias. There's a social worker from Newfoundland whose name is Brenda Lefrancois, Lefrancois. And she writes about what she calls a troubled consciousness. And the idea is that if we're trying to understand our own bias and we're not unsettled by what we're learning, we're not unsettled by what we're discovering in our own bias, we're not doing it well enough. We should be troubled by the thoughts that we have if we're really interrogating our internal biases. We should find ourselves saying, whoa, I actually don't love that about myself. That makes me feel like I messed something up, or that makes me feel like maybe I didn't speak as kindly or as respectfully as I could have on that occasion. But we need to be interrogating those moments to actually unpack the biases that we unconsciously carry. So I encourage people to cultivate a troubled consciousness.
I think
let's cultivate a troubled consciousness.
Mm-hmm. That one's my phrase. Yeah. Troubled consciousness conceptually is hers.
This is a critical reflection of practice. This is another framework that is, and it's actually it's important not to do that work in isolation. I think doing that work with other people so they can call you in a bit as well and be in that shared landscape. Some specifics, right? I love what you were saying about like the media piece. I really, one that I give all my, I'm going to use this term. I say this with endearment and they know this. I know this baby queers, my baby gender folks who are coming out for the first time. I make them watch Paris is Burning. I highly suggest as homework, therapeutic homework, to watch Paris is Burning. It's a documentary about the ballroom scene of gender diverse folks in New York. And just speaking of the underground resiliency and tenacity of a community. It's free on YouTube, actually. So it's a really easy one that's like hard to not watch. Judith Butler, from an academic lens, they write incredible work. Their newest book, Who's Afraid of Gender, actually really tackles the political shifting landscape of gender conversation. I was audiobooking it on the way here. I'm like just about done, so I think it's be pretty okay. And the fictional writers are good too, because fictional writers write. River Solomon's a non-binary Black writer from the U.S. who writes incredible scientific fiction on gender diversity and racial issues, and they write different. Like you'll the experience. There's a real experiential difference when you read, write, and consume and engage with queer content, and it's a really small part of praxis or practical application. That verbiage of allyship we talked about, but it's an easy start. That's like, for me, that's like the first tier. If I'm thinking of like runs on the ladder, first tier is queer media. That's like the easiest way that most people can access. It's more than that, but at minimum, if there's like a simple advice piece, a thing to take away, that'd be a thing to start doing. If you're not already. Yeah.
Alistair, you haven't commented yet. I just wanted to give you the opportunity because we're almost at question period, but I just wanted to give you the opportunity to comment.
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to say practice using they as a singular pronoun.
Oh, so good.
That's such a small and simple thing, but until you are in a session and going, he, she, nah, they, right? Like, practice, it's easy. If you need to, imagine a little mouse in their pocket, so you're talking about them in the plural, whatever trick you need to use.
I heard that before. I like that one.
Somebody forgot their umbrella. I hope they come back and get it. We actually use it all the time. It's only when we talk about people that we seem to trip up on it. So practice that. This is like a small piece of advice.
That's so poignant that's where we're stopping right now too, because it's this very simple thing, but it's a very poignant piece of advice. So thank you for that, and thank you all, everyone. This has been an engaging, exciting conversation. We're going to turn it now to question time, and I know that Haley has been receiving some questions online that she's going to ask the panel.
Yes, and just a reminder that have an ask question and you would like to ask a question, just put it in.
I don't think the mic's on here.
Our best.
Oh, my best.
Is it on now? Yes. Sorry. I just said if you haven't put a question in the chat yet and you would like for the panelists to answer a question of yours, please feel free to pop that in and we will try and get through as many as we can. Before we get to the questions, I'll just say that there are a lot of just very nice comments of people saying thank you and what an amazing conversation this is, and the discussion is so important. So just thank you all for being here and for sharing. We did get a question about gender affirming care for those folks who have been dually diagnosed with intellectual and mental health diagnoses, which I think is probably a fairly specific community that hopefully someone may want to talk to. And have you found access for this population to have more barriers when seeking gender affirming care? They also have an intellectual and mental health diagnosis.
I would be glad to jump in on that, and I think it's a great question. I'm so glad that that's on someone's mind out there. I think, first of all, yes, communities who are dually diagnosed or communities who experience any kind of either underlying intellectual cognitive disability or psychiatric disability are at, I would say, greater risk of having their gender identity literally dismissed, of having their experience of themselves, of their gender identity, of their gendered expression, of their sexual orientation disregarded. And the degree of erasure and invisibility that creates for those individuals is extremely painful and really increases the risk of suicidal ideation, of self-injury, of social isolation. So I think it's something that we really need, again, I'm going to use the word sort of attenuate. We really need to attenuate ourselves to what is it that people are bringing to us. And Adrian, to come back to the word that you've chosen, the sacredness of someone choosing to entrust that information to us. Even if we think that person is not going to have a relationship, or even if we think that person is not going to transition, that's not the point. The point is they're telling us who they are, and we need to honor that. So I think that's the first piece. And it actually ties into something I'd wanted to mention, which is, as clinicians, I think we first need to believe people when they tell us something about themselves. We also need to make room for the fact, as Sarah and a few others have talked about, that can change over time. When someone says, hey, I think that I'm genderqueer, if 2 years later they decide that they're not genderqueer, or they decide that they're a trans man, that's okay. It doesn't mean anything was wrong in that process. it's okay for people to experience their gender, both identity and expression, as fluid. What I do think is also important, though, as much as it's like believe people is the first step, is also to be aware that there are some things that do tend to occur more frequently in the context of a gender diverse population, which are things like autism spectrum disorder. We don't know why there's a correlation, but there is. So if someone comes to you and is not diagnosed as autistic, but is coming to you and presenting as gender diverse, that just might tweak something to say like, oh, I should just sort of hold that in the back of my mind. Do they show me anything else that says we might want to consider screening for autism at some point? And to approach that in a way that is not about pathology, but is really about allowing this person to understand themselves more fully. So to be aware that there's an overlap between neurodiversity, what is sometimes described as being neuroqueer, or being audiqueer and audigender, which is autism and queer, where people relate their experience of being autistic directly to their experience of gender identity as well. But the other piece, and again, this goes back to my background working in mental health in hospitals, is there are outliers where someone will come and say, hey, I think I'm a woman. And we say, cool, what pronouns do you want me to use? She, her, I got you. But in the back of your mind, there can still be questions that exist. And I'll say one example was, we had a client who presented telling us that he was, and I say he because he does identify as male, but he presented to us telling us that he believed he was a woman. And over the course of a few months in hospital, we discovered that he has a somatoform disorder and was misperceiving experiences of his body. And he did not actually end up believing himself to be female. He ended up having an underlying psychotic disorder. So there are obscure possibilities that I think goes back to what is our competence when we're doing this work. Do I expect every clinician to be screening for somatoform disorders? No, of course not. But if you're working with clients who are just coming out as gender diverse, should you have a sense of other developmental and psychiatric possibilities? Yeah, we should.
Anyone else?
Yeah, I was gonna say that, the joke I make with my clients is that the Venn diagram between neurodiversity and gender diversity is a circle. And I think every single gender, and then because of my work actively doing screening for autism and ADHD is a core part of what I promote my work and I do in my work. It's a significant part in understanding too, to the question, the dual stigma that comes within that. There's a lot of internalized ableism regarding how a lot of the folks I work with who are autistic navigate their own autism and how they don't function in the world, and that compares to the ableness of neurotypical folks. That just gets doubled into with their self-questioning. It feels like of their gender diverse experience too, where they already don't believe themselves to be capable or competent because they're told that by so many systems and family, friends, etc. The gender diversity is another layer of that internalized doubt that just takes a lot of patience and gentleness to work through and to be curious about.
It's excellent, and I'm sure very helpful for our viewers. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Oh, sorry. Okay, sorry about that. Oh, we're having a little feedback here. Sorry.
We also got a question. I'm not sure if this is something someone can speak to, but a question about knowing of any organizations that might cover or help defray costs for therapy services for gender diverse individuals and communities. I don't know if anyone has any experience with that.
I mean, I would defer to calling the 519 or Sherburne Health Center to make that inquiry.
Yeah.
For people who are unaware, the 519 is a community center in Toronto. And if you Google the 519, you'll be able to find that.
I think Rainbow Health Ontario, which is affiliated with Sherborne Health, also has lists of some reduced cost therapies as well on their website with their lists of providers.
Right. Perfect. Thank you. We also got a question about residential spaces, such as a treatment facility, and if they are serving a cisgender majority, How can we better serve a trans client who either enters this space or one that is hesitant to access the services offered because of concerns around identity once in this space?
Any thoughts?
Vashti looks like Vashti has a thought.
I don't know that I have a real answer, except we're talking about systems of change, right?
Yeah.
This is where I go back to the system is our client. We're an advocate of the individual with us. So if that means, over lunch, we talked about providing education to physicians and other healthcare providers. And there was a time that I was involved in educating labor and delivery nurses because a trans man was going to give birth in a hospital and no one knew what to expect at that time. And the reality is, if there's an individual who's interested in accessing some kind of like substance use related treatment or some kind of residential programming, then it may be that as social workers or social service workers, our role can be to leverage our privilege, our skills, our knowledge, our networks, if we don't have that skill and knowledge, to go in and provide that education. You know, when I lived in another province, there were times that I would go into workplaces and educate employers on literally how to operationalize legislation that existed because they had no idea how to support a trans person transitioning in their workplace. So if that's the work that we need to do as a social worker, do I do advocacy? Yeah. Do I do psychoeducation? Yeah. Can I do it with a group? Yeah. Great. I'll go do it with a workplace. But I think that those are the ways that we can really make those changes. Unfortunately, it means doing it sometimes one organization at a time right now.
I think also involves a lot of myth busting as well. There's a lot of misconceptions, I think, of the harm that will come to other folks. And there's a big mythology of the transphobia that exists, right? That if a gender diverse person enters into a space, they'll cause harm, or the malicious actor intentionality. This is a part of the rhetoric we're hearing in the political sphere in particular regarding gender diverse peoples. We know the reality is that when gender diverse folks are forcibly assigned into their birth sex in incongruence to their gender diverse identity, they're higher risk of harm by a significant amount. And so that's something that we have to understand too, and maybe interrogate sometimes in our own discomforts or interrogating the discomforts of others. To Bashi's point of the systems work that we have to do, where is this concern coming from? Is it coming from a place potentially of some internalized transphobia mythology of what's going to happen? Is it coming from a place of uncertainty, like how to operationalize the empathy we want to operationalize? Is sometimes to give the benefit of the doubt. That's in and itself. But exploring that and navigating where are those concerns coming from, and how to support the client in being safe and comfortable in the space that they're going to be safe and comfortable is really important.
Can I tack two things onto that? Just further to what Adrienne was saying about the narrative that we're hearing now about trans people in single-sex spaces. A lot of times in those conversations, people forget that trans men exist. So, we're worrying about trans women in the women's bathroom, but nobody wants me in the women's bathroom. Everybody will freak out, and rightly so.
Right.
Just putting that out there. But the other thing that I just wanted to say is it can sometimes be a small thing that can be really helpful for your client. If they're looking at a residential treatment program or something, if you have the ability to pick up the phone and call and ask the questions about, are there single person bathrooms? Are there single person showers? Is there single accommodations available? Being able to make ask those questions on behalf so that your trans or gender diverse client doesn't have to have that vulnerability in asking those questions, because otherwise it's every time you make a phone call, right? You're outing yourself all the time. So that's a way that you can perform, in a quite small and easy way to perform allyship, because you're standing in front of your trans client for that, right? And saying, okay, this isn't going to hurt my feelings or make me feel vulnerable. I'm going to ask the questions.
And to piggyback on that as well, asking those questions, but if the answer is, no, we don't offer single rooms, well, can you?
Yeah.
Right? No, we don't have single stall showers. How many shower facilities are there? Oh, there are 3 separate group showers? Great. Could you make one of them single? Could you make one bathroom single? So I think asking for the exception where required is appropriate.
Mm-hmm. And that carries more weight coming from a colleague than it does from a patient also.
Absolutely.
Excellent conversation.
I think unfortunately we're out of time, but you sort of actually answered one of the other questions that was in the chat. So great job with that. So I'll turn it back over to Christina.
I just want to say what a pleasure this conversation has been. And it started earlier when we did the pre-panel conversation and at lunch today. And this has been, I just think, such a valuable conversation to be had. And I'm certain that our registrants watching, the viewers watching, benefited immensely from it. So I just really want to thank all of you. We could have gone on for so much longer and had so much more conversation. But unfortunately, we have to leave it for now. So again, just really want to thank you all very much for sharing your insights on this extremely important topic. So that concludes our panel discussion. And I would like to thank Adrian, Alistair, Sarah, and Vashti for the insightful conversation and being here today and just really having this brave, bold conversation that is more important today than it ever has been. So thank you all very much for your participation today. It means a great deal to all of us.